Family blood is supposed to be thicker than water, but when millions of dollars are on the line, blood turns to ice. Thomas gave his life to his family's empire, only to be thrown into the streets with absolutely nothing. But his rock bottom was hiding a multi-million-dollar secret. For 32 years, Thomas Caldwell believed in the sanctity of hard work. As the chief operations officer of Caldwell Freight and Logistics, a booming transport empire headquartered in Boston, Thomas was the backbone of the company. While his older half-brother William spent his days schmoozing investors on golf courses, and his stepmother Catherine hosted lavish charity galas to boost her own social standing, Thomas was in the warehouses. He knew the names of the drivers, the logistics software inside out, and the exact margins that kept the company massively profitable. When their father, William Caldwell Sr., suffered a massive fatal stroke on a Tuesday evening in November, Thomas's world stopped. He loved his father fiercely, despite the old man's blind spot when it came to his second wife and his eldest son. The grief had barely settled in Thomas's chest when the trap was sprung. Exactly 3 days after the funeral, Thomas walked into the downtown Boston headquarters, exhausted but ready to keep the company stable. He swiped his keycard at the private executive elevator. It flashed red. Access denied. Thinking it was a glitch, he walked to the security desk. The guard, a man Thomas had personally hired 5 years prior, wouldn't look him in the eye. "I'm sorry, Mr. Caldwell," the guard muttered, handing him a thick manila envelope. "I was told to give you this and escort you off the premises." Inside the envelope was a legal notice drafted by Theodore B. Albright, a high-powered corporate attorney known for his ruthlessness. The document outlined a hostile corporate restructuring. According to a heavily obscured clause in a trust amendment signed by William Sr., just months before his death, while heavily medicated for failing health, all controlling shares were transferred directly to Catherine upon his passing. Catherine had immediately held an emergency board meeting, completely bypassing Thomas. The board, stacked with William's cronies, voted unanimously to terminate Thomas with cause, citing fabricated gross negligence. Thomas marched straight to Theodore Albright's office in the financial district. He demanded answers. The lawyer sat behind a massive mahogany desk, steepling his fingers with a cold, practiced indifference. "It's airtight," Thomas Albright said smoothly. "Your father's signature is verified. The board has spoken. Furthermore, per your employment contract, your severance is voided due to the with cause termination. Your company vehicles, your corporate accounts, and the executive condominium you reside in, which is owned by the Caldwell Trust, must be surrendered." "You're stealing my life," Thomas growled, slamming his hands on the desk. "I built that logistics network. William doesn't even know how to route a freight train." "Security is on its way up," Thomas Albright replied, entirely unbothered. "You have 30 days to vacate the condo. I suggest you start packing." They didn't give him 30 days. Through a series of rapid-fire legal injunctions and frozen assets, William and Catherine choked Thomas out in a week. Because Thomas had trusted his family implicitly, all his major assets, his home, his investments, his primary savings, were tied into the family trust for tax optimization. It was a fatal mistake. They froze it all. By December 4th, Thomas Caldwell, former COO of a $100 million company, was sitting in the driver's seat of his personal vehicle, a 10-year-old Ford F-150 he kept for weekend fishing trips. The rain was pounding against the windshield. He had a duffel bag of clothes, a box of personal photos, and exactly $4,650.22 in a forgotten local credit union account. He was 51 years old, completely isolated, and functionally homeless. He couldn't rent an apartment in Boston. Landlords required proof of income, first, last, and a security deposit. The few friends he reached out to suddenly stopped returning his calls. Nobody wanted to cross Catherine Caldwell in Boston high society. Desperation breeds radical decisions. Sitting in a cheap diner, nursing a black coffee, Thomas opened his laptop. If he couldn't afford a life in the city, he had to find somewhere to simply exist. He started searching for the absolute cheapest land in New England. He just needed a place to park his truck, pitch a tent, and figure out his next move. That's when he found the Windsor County tax deed auction in rural Vermont. 2 days later, Thomas was sitting in a drafty wood-paneled municipal hall in Ludlow, Vermont. The room smelled of wet wool and old coffee. The auctioneer, a tired-looking local official, was reading off parcels of land that owners had abandoned due to unpaid taxes. Property number 42, the auctioneer droned. 12 acres off Old County Road. Contains one uninhabitable structure. Property has been in arrears for 12 years. Opening bid is $3,000. Thomas looked at the blurry black and white photo projected on the wall. It was a dense wall of trees with what looked like the collapsed roof of a shack barely visible. It was desolate. It was middle of nowhere. It was perfect. He raised his numbered paddle. The auctioneer looked surprised. He scanned the room. The local farmers and property flippers kept their hands firmly in their laps. A few of them actively scoffed. 3,000 bid, the auctioneer said. Do I hear 3,500? Silence. Going once, going twice, sold to bidder number 18 for $3,000. With taxes and administrative fees, Thomas walked out of the municipal hall having spent $3,840. He now had less than $800 to his name, but he owned 12 acres of earth. He had a sanctuary, however broken it might be. He drove out to Old County Road to claim his kingdom, completely unaware of the dark history buried beneath its soil. Old County Road wasn't so much a road as it was a deeply rutted dirt path that wound its way up the side of a jagged, pine-covered mountain. When Thomas finally pulled his Ford F-150 up to the property line, his heart sank. The phrase uninhabitable structure was a generous compliment. It was a ruin. The remains of an old farmhouse stood choked by decades of aggressive, creeping ivy and thorny blackberry brambles. The roof had caved in long ago, leaving only a stone chimney jutting into the gray winter sky like a crooked finger. The 12 acres of land were a chaotic jungle of rotting deadwood, overgrown weeds, and dense, dark pine trees that blocked out the sun. It was a graveyard of a farm. Thomas stepped out of the truck. The silence was deafening, broken only by the wind howling through the branches. The temperature was dropping fast, hovering just above freezing. For a brief, terrifying moment, the reality of his situation crushed him. 2 weeks ago, he was sleeping in a climate-controlled penthouse overlooking the Boston Harbor. Now, he was shivering in the Vermont wilderness, preparing to sleep in the bed of his truck. He took a deep breath, the freezing air burning his lungs. Survival first, he thought. Pity later. The next morning, driven by a primal need to establish a foothold, Thomas drove into the small town of Ludlow to visit the county clerk's office to finalize the deed transfer. Behind the counter stood Sarah Jenkins, a woman in her late 60s with sharp, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. As she stamped his paperwork, she looked at him over her reading glasses. "You're the one who bought the old Cooper place," Sarah said, her tone a mix of curiosity and sympathy. "You plan on logging it?" "I plan on living on it," Thomas replied, trying to project a confidence he didn't feel. Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Living? Honey, nobody has lived on that dirt since 1948. You know the history of that land, don't you?" Thomas shook his head. "I just needed something cheap." Sarah sighed, leaning against the counter. It belonged to Jebediah Cooper. He was a piece of work. Rumor had it he ran moonshine during Prohibition, but that wasn't the half of it. Jebediah was deeply paranoid. Didn't trust banks, didn't trust the government, didn't trust his own shadow. In the late 1920s, there was a string of massive bank robberies up near Burlington. The Green Mountain heists, they called them. Hundreds of thousands of dollars of fortune back then just vanished into thin air. A lot of folks suspected Jebediah was the getaway driver or the stash man. She handed Thomas his copy of the deed. The police raided that farm 3 times before Jebediah died in 48, tore the farmhouse to the studs, dug up the barn floor. They never found a single dime. The property went to a distant nephew who let it rot, and it's been trapped in tax limbo ever since. If you're gonna build there, watch your step. The ground is treacherous. Thomas thanked her and headed back to the property. He didn't care about old ghost stories or Prohibition-era rumors. He had immediate problems. He needed shelter before the true Vermont winter hit. For the next 3 weeks, Thomas experienced a grueling physical transformation. Armed with nothing but a cheap hardware store machete, an axe, and sheer, burning anger at his family, he began clearing the land. He hacked away at the relentless blackberry bushes that tore at his clothes and skin. He chopped deadwood until his hands were covered in bloody, calloused blisters. He lost 15 pounds, his corporate softness melting away into lean, hardened muscle. He managed to clear a small patch of land near the stone chimney of the ruined house. He bought a heavy-duty canvas tent and a small, cast-iron wood stove with his dwindling funds, creating a makeshift, heated shelter. It was brutal, exhausting work, but for the first time in his life, Thomas felt a strange sense of ownership. No board of directors could vote him out of this tent. Then, the first major storm of the season hit. It wasn't snow, but a torrential, freezing rain accompanied by gale-force winds. Thomas huddled inside his tent, feeding the small wood stove as the wind screamed through the valley. Trees groaned and snapped in the darkness. The storm raged for 14 straight hours. When dawn finally broke, the rain had stopped, leaving a heavy, freezing mist in the air. Thomas stepped out of his tent to survey the damage. The landscape had changed. About 50 yards behind the ruined farmhouse, a massive ancient oak tree, easily 100 years old, had finally lost its battle with the elements. The wind and the saturated ground had uprooted it completely. It lay on its side, a massive crater of dark earth exposed where its root system used to be. Knowing the fallen tree would provide enough firewood for the entire winter, Thomas grabbed his axe and walked toward the crater. As he approached the torn-up earth, he noticed something unnatural. The roots of the massive oak hadn't grown deep. They had grown outward, spreading wide because they had hit something solid beneath the soil. Thomas slid down into the muddy crater. He used his boots to kick away the loose dirt and broken roots. He heard a dull, metallic clink. Frowning, he dropped to his knees and started digging with his bare hands, the freezing mud caking beneath his fingernails. After 10 minutes of frantic clearing, his breath caught in his throat. It wasn't just a rock. It was hand-laid fieldstone, perfectly circular and meticulously mortared. It was the top of a well, but that wasn't what made Thomas's blood run cold. The well was completely sealed. Covering the stone circle was an enormous, custom-forged iron plate, at least an inch thick, and welded to the center of the iron plate was a heavy, industrial-grade steel hasp. Securing the hasp was an antique, heavy-duty padlock, oxidized and fused together by decades of rust. Thomas stared at it, the freezing wind entirely forgotten. Why would someone build a stone well, forge a massive iron lid for it, lock it with a heavy padlock, and then bury the entire thing under 3 feet of earth? And more importantly, why plant an oak tree directly on top of it, ensuring it would be hidden for generations? Sarah Jenkins' words echoed in his mind. Jebediah was deeply paranoid. Hundreds of thousands of dollars. The police dug up the barn floor, but they never found a single dime. Thomas reached out and touched the freezing, rusted padlock. The metal was unyielding. Whatever was down there, Jebediah Cooper had gone to extraordinary, obsessive lengths to make sure absolutely no one would ever find it. And Thomas Caldwell had just unearthed it. Sleep was completely impossible. Thomas spent the remainder of the freezing night pacing inside his tent, his mind racing through 100 different scenarios. If the well was a stash from the 1920s Green Mountain heists, he couldn't just call the local police. The government would seize it as evidence of a century-old federal crime, tie it up in probate or civil forfeiture, and he would be right back where he started, penniless and freezing in the Vermont woods. He had to get inside that well himself. At first light, Thomas drove his battered Ford into Ludlow. He had less than $800 to his name. He walked into the local hardware store and spent $300 of it on a high-voltage, battery-powered DeWalt angle grinder, 6 diamond grit cutting wheels, a heavy crowbar, and a high-lumen tactical flashlight. When he returned to the crater, the mist had cleared, revealing the stark, imposing reality of the iron lid. Thomas climbed down into the mud, snapped a battery into the grinder, and pulled the trigger. The scream of the saw blade biting into the oxidized steel shattered the quiet of the forest. Sparks showered over his thick canvas jacket, hissing as they hit the wet earth. The padlock was a beast of early 20th century American manufacturing, forged solid and thickened by decades of rust. It took Thomas 2 hours and 4 broken cutting wheels to finally shear through the heavy steel hasp. With a deafening crack, the metal gave way. Thomas dropped the grinder, his arms trembling from the intense vibration. He wedged the tip of the crowbar under the lip of the heavy iron plate. It must have weighed 300 pounds. Straining until his vision blurred and a loud groan escaped his chest, he used the fulcrum of the stone lip to slowly slide the massive lid away. It hit the mud with a heavy, wet thud. A rush of stale, incredibly dry air wafted up from the darkness. It didn't smell like stagnant water or rot. It smelled like dust, old canvas, and cosmoline grease. Thomas clicked on his tactical flashlight and pointed the beam downward. The well was a fake. It was only 15 feet deep, built entirely as a subterranean vault. There was no water. Instead, the beam of light illuminated a dry wooden platform constructed of thick cedar planks, which naturally resisted rot. Resting on the platform were 4 heavy, olive-drab military footlockers. They were covered in a thick layer of protective grease, perfectly preserving them from the dampness of the surrounding earth. Thomas's heart hammered against his ribs. He tied a heavy nylon rope to the exposed roots of the fallen oak tree and rappelled himself down the stone shaft. The air was perfectly still at the bottom. He knelt beside the first footlocker. The latches were stiff, but not locked. He pried the lid open. Inside, wrapped tightly in heavy oilcloth canvas, were rows upon rows of tightly bundled paper. Thomas pulled out a bundle and peeled back the stiff, yellowed cloth. He gasped. They were United States currency notes, but unlike any he had ever seen. They were significantly larger than modern bills, crisp and entirely uncirculated. He held his flashlight closer. They were 1,928 Series $500 bills featuring William McKinley and stacks of $1,000 bills bearing the face of Grover Cleveland. Tucked into the corners were separate, heavier canvas bags. Thomas opened one and poured the contents into his palm. Dozens of heavy, gleaming silver Liberty dollars and pristine gold certificates tumbled out, glowing dull yellow in the harsh light of the flashlight. Jebediah Cooper hadn't just hidden the heist money, he had hoarded it, carefully packing it away with obsessive paranoia, waiting for a day that never came. Over the next 6 hours, Thomas hauled all 4 footlockers up to the surface. Sitting inside his canvas tent, with the wood stove roaring, he took an inventory of his discovery. The face value of the currency was staggering, roughly $650,000 in 1920s cash. But Thomas, with his background in high-level corporate logistics and asset management, knew immediately that face value meant absolutely nothing. These were uncirculated, high-denomination, large-sized notes. To a government bank, they were an anomaly to be seized. To a private historical numismatist, they were the Holy Grail. He needed to liquidate the stash without triggering federal alarms, and he couldn't use traditional banking channels. He needed someone ruthless, wealthy, and entirely independent. He thought back to his time at Caldwell Freight. 3 years ago, he had personally managed the secure transport of a multi-million-dollar private antiquities collection for Arthur Pendleton. Pendleton was a reclusive, eccentric Boston billionaire who made his fortune in tech patents. More importantly, Pendleton violently despised William and Catherine Caldwell, having once publicly called William a suit stuffed with incompetence at a charity gala. Pendleton respected only one person at Caldwell Logistics, Thomas. Thomas hiked 2 miles up the road to get a single bar of cell service and made the call. Pendleton, the gruff voice, answered on the 3rd ring. Arthur, it's Thomas Caldwell. I need a private meeting, completely off the books, and I need your most discreet numismatist. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I heard what your stepmother did to you, Thomas. It was a butchery. If you found a way to hit back, I'm listening. 3 days later, a black, heavily tinted Mercedes Sprinter van crawled up the deeply rutted Old County Road. Arthur Pendleton stepped out into the freezing Vermont mud wearing a tailored Italian overcoat, accompanied by a nervous-looking man wearing white cotton gloves, the appraiser. Inside Thomas's cramped, wood-heated tent, the appraiser spent 4 agonizing hours examining the bills under a high-powered loupe, verifying serial numbers, checking the silk fibers in the paper, and testing the gold certificates. Finally, the appraiser looked up, his face pale. Mr. Pendleton, this is the single largest completely uncirculated cache of 1,928 high-denomination currency I have ever seen. There are bills in here that collectors have spent their entire lives trying to track down. It belongs in the Smithsonian. It's not going to the Smithsonian, Pendleton said sharply. His eyes locked on Thomas. What's the private market value, assuming a quiet, off-the-books treaty sale? The appraiser swallowed hard. To the right network of private buyers, easily $18 to $20 million. Thomas didn't flinch. He looked directly at the billionaire. I don't have the time or the network to piece this out to private buyers, Arthur. I want a clean, single transaction. I will sell you the entire collection right now for $14 million. Cash deposited into an offshore holding company, completely insulated from the Caldwell Trust. Pendleton smiled. It was a predatory, deeply satisfied smile. You're selling it at a discount to buy speed. You want to go to war. I want my company back, Thomas corrected. And I want them on the street. Done, Pendleton said, extending his hand. The financial machinery moved with terrifying speed. With Pendleton's vast legal resources acting as a buffer, Thomas established Cooper and Oak Holdings, an anonymous private equity firm registered in Delaware. Within a week, $14 million of pristine, untraceable capital flooded into the firm's accounts. Thomas didn't buy sports cars or luxury mansions. He stayed in his tent in Vermont, bought a satellite internet rig, and began to hunt. He spent the next 8 months watching Caldwell Freight and Logistics bleed. Without Thomas running the actual operations, the company's efficiency plummeted. William's golf buddies quickly realized William had no idea how to manage supply chain crises. Major contracts with national retailers expired and were not renewed. Fuel costs skyrocketed, and William failed to hedge the margins. Meanwhile, Catherine was bleeding the corporate trust dry to maintain her Boston high society lifestyle, totally oblivious to the impending collapse. By September, Caldwell Freight was in a death spiral. They had defaulted on 2 major loans with a prominent commercial bank, and their stock valuation was in the gutter. The bank was preparing to trigger a hostile foreclosure and liquidate the company's assets to recoup their losses. That is when Cooper and Oak Holdings struck. Through his proxy lawyers, Thomas approached the bank holding Caldwell Freight's debt. He offered to buy the toxic debt outright, in cash, at a slight premium above market value. The bank, desperate to get the failing loans off their books, eagerly agreed. Overnight, the anonymous Cooper and Oak Holdings became the primary lien holder of Caldwell Freight and Logistics. And per the aggressive terms of the original loan agreements, a default allowed the debt holder to immediately seize controlling shares of the company. On a rainy Tuesday morning in November, exactly 1 year to the day since his father's death, an emergency board meeting was called at the downtown Boston headquarters. William Caldwell sat at the head of the mahogany conference table, sweating profusely. Catherine sat next to him, clutching her designer handbag, her face tight with panic. Theodore B. Albright, the ruthless attorney who had thrown Thomas out, sat quietly in the corner, shuffling legal documents. The representatives from Cooper and Oak Holdings are here, Albright announced, his usually smooth voice tinged with genuine nervousness. They are executing the seizure of all controlling shares. By the end of this hour, they will own 85% of this company. I advise full cooperation. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open. William stood up, forcing a diplomatic smile to greet the corporate raiders, but the smile instantly froze on his face. Catherine let out a sharp, choked gasp, dropping her handbag onto the floor. Thomas Caldwell walked into the room. He wasn't the broken, exhausted man they had thrown onto the street a year ago. He was lean, deeply tanned from a year of hard outdoor labor, and wearing a sharply tailored charcoal gray suit. He walked to the opposite end of the table and sat down, resting his hands calmly on the mahogany wood. "Hello, William." "Catherine," Thomas said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. "Thomas?" William stammered, his eyes darting wildly between his brother and the lawyer. "What? What are you doing here? You can't be here. Security." "Security works for me now, William," Thomas replied softly. "I am the sole proprietor of Cooper and Oak Holdings. I own the debt, I own the trucks, I own the warehouses, and as of 5 minutes ago, I own this building." Catherine stood up, her face flushed with rage. "This is illegal! Theodore, do something! He doesn't have the money for this! He had nothing!" Theodore Albright looked down at his paperwork, refusing to make eye contact with Catherine. "Mrs. Caldwell, the financial transfers are verified. It is completely legal. He orchestrated a leveraged buyout of your debt. He is the majority shareholder." Thomas leaned forward. "A year ago, you used a legal technicality to steal my life's work while my father's grave was still fresh. You left me with $4,000 and nowhere to go." The boardroom was deathly silent. Effective immediately, Thomas continued, sliding a manila envelope across the table toward his brother. "The board is dissolved. William, you are terminated, with cause, for gross financial negligence. Your corporate accounts are frozen. Catherine, your executive condo is owned by the company. You have 30 days to vacate, though, having been in your shoes, I strongly suggest you start packing today." "You can't do this to us. We're family!" William yelled, his voice cracking. "Family," Thomas repeated, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "Family is thicker than water, but millions of dollars turns blood to ice. Theodore, call security. Have them escorted off the premises." As the guards, the very same guards who had thrown Thomas out a year prior, escorted a screaming Catherine and a weeping William out of the boardroom, Thomas walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Boston Harbor. He had won. He had taken back everything they stole from him, and he had decimated them using the very system they thought they controlled. But as he looked out at the sprawling city below, he realized he didn't want the corner office anymore. He hired a brilliant, aggressive CEO to run Caldwell Logistics under his remote direction. A month later, Thomas Caldwell was back on the deeply rutted dirt path of Old County Road in Vermont. He stood over the patch of earth where the old oak tree had fallen. The iron lid was gone, the well filled in and stabilized. In its place, a construction crew was laying the foundation for a stunning, custom-built timber frame cabin. It was quiet here. The air was clean, and the only sounds were the wind in the pines and the distant call of a hawk. Thomas finally had a home that no one could ever take from him, built firmly on the bedrock of a 100-year-old secret. What would you do if pushed to the absolute edge, only to find a buried fortune? Thomas's story proves that sometimes losing everything is the only way to find your ultimate victory. If you love this incredible tale of betrayal, discovery, and sweet revenge, hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more jaw-dropping true stories.